United States priorities at the United Nations. The list of problems connected with the United Nations is one subject. The issues, I almost misstated totally there, but the issues of interest in the United States are also innumerable and very complex. Most of you know what they are. The priorities may be different, but we're fortunate today to have the authoritative voice on what those issues are, what's most important to the United States, and how we view them with us. We're delighted that Ambassador Bolton is joining us. And as you all know, in addition to that, he has a reputation for being forthright, and that connected with his authoritative position should make this a wonderful program. Ambassador Bolton is local in a sense. I think the gentleman who was headmaster of the middle school at McDonough, Mr. Thompson, is with us today. He admitted you there in 7th grade, I believe. You have innumerable fans here in Baltimore. And McDonough's fans are going up, the Orioles are going down. The ambassador went from McDonough to Yale, graduated summa cum laude, much to the delight, I'm sure, of the McDonough people. He received his Doctor of Jurisprudence from Yale as well. He's served for over 10 years in major Washington law firms. He served in government as the counsel to the administration, the Agency for International Development. He also served as the assistant administrator of that particular organization. He was in the Department of Justice as Assistant Attorney General, and he's held the position of Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. And shortly after that, he was Senior Vice President at the American Enterprise Institute. During that period of time, he first addressed this council in 1989 in the fall on the subject of American sovereignty and international law. I should remind all of you that nearly all of our programs are on videotape. That one is included. They're available to council members for either rent or purchase. Of greater importance with respect to this moment, however, is the fact that the ambassador served as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and National Security from 2001 to 2005, and as all of you know, was appointed and approved as our ambassador to the United Nations in 2005. Let me make one reminder to you. The ambassador will call upon questioners. Please make your questions concise. Don't make a policy statement, please, only out of courtesy to everybody in the room who's waiting for an answer from Ambassador Bolton. It's my enormous pleasure to present a very distinguished citizen of Baltimore, the Honorable Ambassador Bolton.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and my thanks to all of you for being patient enough to stick around. The weather in New York was not terribly cooperative, among other things, so I apologize for being late, and I'll try and stay a little bit longer, perhaps, to answer some questions. I'm looking forward to meeting Quentin Thompson, who I can't see because of the lights, but I remember him well from 7th and 8th grade at McDonough, and I hope he hasn't told too many stories from those days. The issues before the United Nations today, in which the United States has a stake, are really quite considerable, and I want to touch on at least a couple of them in my opening remarks, and then I'd be pleased to try and answer your questions on other issues that I might not cover, or other questions of American foreign policy. I think without any question, the most significant issue that we confront in the Security Council today, and indeed the most significant threat that the United States faces in the world today from any given country, is the government of Iran's nearly 20-year-long effort to acquire nuclear weapons. This has been a strategic decision that the government of Iran has been pursuing for much of that time in a clandestine fashion. It has concealed what it has been doing from the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's lied to the IAEA. It's obstructed the IAEA. It's done things like destroying buildings and bulldozing thousands of cubic yards of dirt in order to remove evidence of its nuclear activities from IAEA inspectors. And it has followed a concerted plan to acquire a completely indigenous capability over all the various aspects of the nuclear fuel cycle, from literally mining uranium in the ground through all of the complex technological processes that you have to go through to take uranium from its natural state, where the critical U-235 isotope is only 0.7% of all uranium, to enrich it to weapons grade levels of over 90%. And the government of Iran has systematically over the years attempted to acquire both the technical knowledge and the materials and sensitive equipment that are necessary to accomplish this task. It has dealt with the illicit proliferation network of Dr. A.Q. Khan, which the efforts of the United States and Great Britain and other cooperating countries shut down a few years ago. Dr. Khan, revered in Pakistan as the father of their nuclear weapons program, based on technology he stole from a European corporation and which he, over the years, proceeded to sell or transfer to countries like Libya, North Korea, and Iran. The Iranians say that their nuclear program is purely for peaceful civil nuclear power needs. And they say that they need to do this because, after all, they're running out of oil and natural gas. Now, of course, Iran is one of the world's principal petroleum exporting countries, and so some years ago we asked our Department of Energy what is the exact status of their reserves of oil and natural gas, and what is the likelihood that, in fact, Iran is running out of those natural resources. And the Department of Energy did calculations and, in fact, concluded that, indeed, Iran is running out of oil and natural gas. At its present rate of export and consumption, it will probably run out of oil and natural gas in 300 or 400 years. So of course, it's only prudent planning that you'd want to have a little nuclear capability on the side against the day that the oil and natural gas runs out. This is typical of the way the government of Iran has operated. If it didn't have anything to conceal, one would have to ask why it comes up with excuses that are so transparently wrong, why it conceals information, why it tries to deceive the IAEA. That's the kind of guilty intent that I think is yet another piece of evidence for the objectives that Iran is seeking. And we know that not only is it attempting to perfect all of the various pieces of technology that it needs to have this indigenous capability, this indigenous control across the nuclear fuel cycle, but it's engaged in a concerted and systematic effort to expand the range and accuracy of its ballistic missile capability, thus moving toward the point where it can marry the nuclear weapon program with its ballistic missile program and have a delivery capability that's critical in its region and in the larger world as the range and accuracy of those ballistic missiles increases. But even that's not the only part of the threat that bothers us about Iran. Iran, for decades, has been the central banker of international terrorism, funding groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and numerous other terrorist groups. So we face in Iran the very real threat that if once it acquires actual nuclear weapons, we would risk that these weapons could be delivered not simply through ballistic missiles, but put in the hands of a terrorist group and transported almost anywhere in the world. So these capabilities, both in terms of its terrorist connections and in terms of its proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, make Iran truly the most threatening state that we face today. And as if those capabilities aren't bad enough, we also look at the intentions of the government of Iran, particularly under its new leader, Ahmadinejad. This is a man who has said that the Holocaust never took place, who has said that Israel should be wiped off the map, who last year sponsored a conference with the charming title, The World Without the United States, and who has sponsored a sequel this year called The World Without Israel. This is not the sort of figure that inspires any confidence that an Iran with nuclear weapons will behave in a responsible fashion. So the combination both of the evident capabilities that Iran is developing and the mindset of a leadership such as President Ahmadinejad is more than ample reason to view Iran as a threat to international peace and security, a threat to our interests, our deployed forces, our citizens in the region, the citizens of our friends and allies in the region like Israel and Turkey, and increasingly a threat in ever larger concentric circles as those ballistic missile capabilities develop. To address this threat over the past almost 4 years, we have been pursuing a diplomatic strategy. We have been attempting in the International Atomic Energy Agency to draw attention to the risks and the dangers posed by Iran's nuclear weapons program. We have been ratcheting up the pressure in the IAEA, calling on Iran to give up the critical search for its ability to enrich uranium, to get highly enriched uranium that can be used in nuclear weapons. And finally, in February of this year, we succeeded in convincing a large majority of the Board of Governors of the International Atomic Energy Agency to vote to refer the Iranian nuclear weapons program to the UN Security Council as a threat to international peace and security. Now, our objective in the Security Council is to increase the pressure on Iran, to convince them that their pursuit of nuclear weapons is not ultimately in their own national best interest, and that the consequences of continuing to proceed down that line are not going to be acceptable. In late April or late March, we reached unanimous agreement in the Security Council to issue what's called a presidential statement by the President of the Council for that month, calling on Iran to give up the pursuit of uranium enrichment. This was consistent with the resolutions of the IAEA board that had been adopted by the board. We gave Iran essentially 30 days to comply with that request, bringing it to the end of April. And of course, the end of April came and went, and Iran hadn't done a single thing to comply with the request of the Security Council. So we began the next stage of work in the Council, which is to pass a resolution under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, essentially saying the same thing, demanding that Iran stop the enrichment of uranium, stop its pursuit of perfecting that technology. The reason we're going to pursue such a resolution under Chapter 7 is that's the mandatory provision of the UN Charter. Iran, as a UN member, would be obligated to comply with that resolution. And then the ball would be squarely in Iran's court, and the consequences evident for Iran to see, because if it failed to comply at that point with the Council's demand, then the next step would be the consideration of economic sanctions. Now, one of the principal tacks we've been taking in the past year is to make sure that we are closely aligned with our principal European allies, the principal European countries that have tried in their own way over the past 2.5 years to negotiate with Iran, Britain, France, and Germany, which have offered Iran enormously valuable economic incentives. If only Iran would give up the pursuit of its uranium enrichment capability. Negotiations which Iran has consistently refused to enter into in good faith, refusing the basic point that their pursuit of uranium enrichment capabilities caused other countries to lose confidence in what they were going to do with that capability once they had it. But we have now come together again, not only with the major European countries, but also with Russia and China in a meeting that Secretary Rice had in New York about 10 days ago, where the 5 permanent members of the Security Council agreed that they would try one more time outside the context of the Security Council to give Iran, to give the leadership of the government of Iran a very stark choice. And it would be framed this way, that Iran would be given a package, part of which would be a package of incentives derived by the European Union, and it would be an elaboration of the very, very generous offers that the European Union had been making to Iran over the past several years, combined with offers that the Russian Federation has been making to guarantee a supply of fuel for these mythical nuclear power reactors that the Iranians want to use to generate electricity. The Russians would be in a very advantageous economic position if Iran were to do that, but Iran has spurned that as well. So all of the incentives will be put together in one package and presented to Iran, together with a package of disincentives, including economic sanctions, that would make it very clear to Iran that if they chose to ignore not only the views of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, but the broadly expressed views of almost the entire membership of the International Atomic Energy Agency, that if they chose that course, they would be increasingly isolated internationally. Now, the package isn't ready yet, but in typical fashion, earlier this week, the Iranians rejected the incentive part of it. Even though it wasn't finished, hadn't been presented, they rejected it. So you can imagine what their view of the disincentives package is going to be. I expect that in the next week to 2 weeks, this effort will proceed further. We obviously will await the decision by the government of Iran on what it's going to do, but if they continue to pursue the course that they've been relentlessly pursuing nearly 20 years now and reject yet again, this very generous offer by the Europeans, then I think we'll be back in the Security Council looking to pass our Chapter 7 resolution. And I think that the vote at this point would be very, very substantially in favor of that resolution. We certainly hope that Russia and China will join in with us. The other permanent members, France and Britain, have been co-sponsors of the resolution, the leading drafters of it. I think of the 10 non-permanent members of the Council, we're going to get almost all of them. I hope the Russians and the Chinese, if it turns out that this is the course we pursue, will join with us so that we send an unmistakable signal to Iran about how united people are in their opposition to Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. But if Russia and China are not prepared to join, we will proceed in any event, because we think it's important that the Security Council make a clear statement of the behavior that we expect from Iran. Now, I focus on this because the highest priority President Bush has in this matter is to resolve the Iranian nuclear weapons program through peaceful and diplomatic means. And over 3 years now, nearly 3.5 years, we have been pursuing this objective through peaceful and diplomatic means in the International Atomic Energy Agency, now in the Security Council, together with our allies, together with Russia and China. We have tried in so many ways to make it clear to Iran that if they were to give up the pursuit of nuclear weapons, and if they were to give up their support for international terrorism, that they could have a different relationship with the United States. And just this week, we've had clear proof, clear evidence to the government of Iran of what can happen if, in fact, they were to make the strategic decisions in these 2 critical areas. Just earlier this week, the State Department announced that we would be removing Libya from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, and we would be moving to restore full diplomatic relations with Libya. Why did we do that? Because 2.5 years ago, the government of Libya abandoned its pursuit of weapons of mass destruction. It opened up its nuclear and chemical weapons sites to inspections by the Central Intelligence Agency and the British Secret Intelligence Service. They were able to go wherever they wanted to inside Libya and verify what we knew about the Libyan nuclear weapons program. Libya went so far as to say you can package up our nuclear weapons program, which we did, and we shipped it to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where it now resides. Together with Libya's decision to give up terrorism and indeed to begin cooperating in very extensive ways with us and with others in the war on terrorism. This has led to the decision that after decades of not recognizing Colonel Gaddafi's government, that we will resume full diplomatic relations. We didn't seek the overthrow of Colonel Gaddafi's regime. You don't have to like it, but you can recognize that by abandoning the pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, by taking that proliferation threat off the table, and by shifting 180 degrees in their position on terrorism, they have come to the point where they merit our full diplomatic recognition. And Iran, and I might say North Korea, while we're on the subject, could do the same thing. If the government of Iran were to make the right strategic decision to stop financing and supporting terrorism, to give up its pursuit of nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction, it could have a completely different relationship with the United States. And I can say that if Iran made that decision, there's still room at Oak Ridge, Tennessee for the Iranian nuclear weapons program right next to the Libyan nuclear weapons program, and I would look forward to the day when we could open that exhibit. I'd like to stop there and then take your questions, and I want to thank you again for sticking around. And so now, as we said, we'll take questions. I think probably the easiest thing is to do it from the microphones, because then everybody can hear what people are saying. So why don't we alternate back and forth, and maybe you'd be so kind as just to tell me who you are. Yes, sir, over here.
Bruce Brown, Columbia, Maryland. I'd like to ask you if you believe that the polarization of your image before your approval in the Senate was entirely partisan.
Well, you know, I don't suppose it was entirely partisan, and I'd have to say that you know, if I were an objective member of the public and believed half of what some people said about me, I probably wouldn't have voted to confirm me either. But you know, just doesn't happen to be true. And the unfortunate fact was we never, on the Senate floor, never actually got an up or down vote on confirmation. And I wish we had been able to, because I think I would have been confirmed. But you know, fate is what it is, and I'm very happy that President Bush gave me the recess appointment, and I can tell both my supporters and those who oppose my nomination, I still enjoy every day of it up here. Yes, sir.
Ambassador Bolton, I'm David Kamak. I'm active in the United Nations Association and Citizens for Global Solutions, and we have, through that medium, heard that you proved to be rather disruptive at the last summit, bringing so many amendments to the hope for a major reform in the United Nations. I would like to hear from your point of view, do you believe in the value of a United Nations or some international governing body?
I can tell you I believe in the United Nations. I do not believe in an international governing body, and thank God the United Nations is not that. The meeting to which you're referring was a summit that took place at the United Nations of about 150 heads of state from around the world. And when I was appointed by President Bush on August 1st, negotiations were well underway for a document to be issued by the heads of state, referred to poetically as the outcome document. Because that was going to be the outcome of the summit. The outcome document turned out to be about 35 single-space pages on a whole range of subjects. I doubt that any one of the 150 heads of state actually read it, but it was a document that I considered, but not just me personally, the government of the United States considered had a lot of things that were pernicious to our national interest. So it's true we submitted a lot of amendments. I never counted the amendments myself. I was too busy trying to advocate their adoption. I'm told there were between 400 and 700. I can tell you I didn't write any of them myself. They were all written in the State Department, and for those of you who have ever been in the government, I can tell you they went through the full State Department clearance process. They weren't my brainchildren, although I would have been proud if I had written those amendments. They were the product of the entire State Department. Why did we advance them? because we wanted changes in the document. We wanted changes in the document we thought were in the interest of the United States of America. That's what American diplomats do. And I'm proud of the role that we played. I think the outcome document was much better as a result of our effort. I only wish I had gotten there a couple months earlier, because it would have been even better.
My question is closer to home. President Bush addressed the nation on Monday on the subject of illegal immigration, and yet I have material here that says the United Nations doesn't recognize the concept of illegal immigration and refuses to use that term when referring to foreigners who flout U.S. immigration laws. As a staunch supporter of sovereignty, which you are, and I am a passionate supporter of U.S. sovereignty, how can we have any future if nations cannot defend their own borders? Thank you.
There's no doubt but that control over immigration matters is a question for individual nations, and that the role of the United Nations in such matters is extremely limited. There are agencies in the UN system, notably the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, that deal with questions of refugee flows across borders, but that is not the same as questions of migration, and I think it's such a question of such extreme sensitivity that it's very unlikely that the UN would make much of a contribution in that area. And it's certainly the position of the United States when matters like this are discussed in the United Nations that they are decisions of each sovereign nation. So I don't at this point see any substantial threat of UN activity in this area, although migration is a subject of considerable concern for many countries, for economic as well as political reasons. But the decision of who to let into your country and who to make a citizen of your country is obviously a sovereign one, and for the United States and for everybody else.
Good. I hope you defend it. Thank you.
Thank you.
To be concise and direct, what are your goals and expectations for this summer's conference on small arms?
Well, this is a follow-up to a conference that was actually held in 2001 in New York, dealing on questions of small arms and light weapons internationally. And I think that at the conference in 2001, we developed, in negotiations with the other participants, a very good program of work to stop illicit transfers of weapons, violating patent and other rights, keeping control of the flow of weapons in situations where American and Allied service people would be put in danger. I will say, and I said this when I made the U.S. speech to the 2001 conference, there is an agenda that some people had to turn the concern about the international flow of small arms and light weapons into an agenda of gun control. And I think there are some groups in the United States, and it's not just in the area of firearms, that have found a new strategy to advance their policy objectives. When they find their objectives frustrated in Congress or in state legislatures, they go outside of the United States and try and get the issue brought into an international context, hoping in many respects to box the United States into a corner. And some people, I think, were approaching the 2001 conference with that strategy in mind. So in the course of the address that I gave to that conference, which once again had been fully cleared around the State Department, I said that the United States is not going to agree to any international convention or treaty or arrangement which, if enacted as positive law in the United States, would violate the Constitution. And this caused great consternation on the part of some people who thought that they had found a way around the Second Amendment. And the objectives that we had in 2001 remain our objectives for the conference this summer, and I expect even in this new, different position to be an active participant in that conference.
You said earlier you take the UN seriously, and I guess I'd like to ask on a personal level, how do you do that when they seem to do some strange things like putting Cuba and China on the Human Rights Council, and they do some things that seem openly hostile to the interests of the United States?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question, and it recalls to me the politics of the late 19th century in the plain states of the United States, one of the campaigns, this is not a partisan comment for today, but the Democratic candidate accused the Republican candidate of not being sufficiently attentive to the needs of farmers. And the Democratic candidate said of the Republican candidate, he said, "They believe in the grasshopper," which was destroying crops in the plain states at the time. And I guess I would plead guilty to believing in the grasshopper. You better believe in the grasshopper, because if you don't, you're not going to be equipped to deal with it. And in that sense, I think that what happens at the UN should be taken seriously, both because of the possibilities that affords for implementation of American foreign policy goals, but also because of the risks that are entailed if we're not attentive to it. A lot of things happen in the UN system really below the radar screen in this country. You can't believe how many conferences and meetings there are, how many declarations are made, how many of these outcome documents are negotiated tediously in rooms full of diplomats that nobody pays any attention to, until, like a coral reef, over the years, one declaration on top of another declaration, suddenly you find yourself confronted with something that you never knew existed. And that's why you need to be attentive at all levels to these declarations. Even this outcome document the gentleman asked me about before, 35 single-space pages, I'll just ask, and I bet I know what response I'll get. How many of you in this room have read the outcome document from the 2005 summit? 1, 2, okay, 3 of us. And yet, you will find that this outcome document is quoted back at the United States over and over again in discussions in the General Assembly and its principal committees and other international negotiations around the world. And you, fortunately, have never had to read the thing. That's why we need to be alert and attentive, even when things happen that are seemingly inexplicable, which sadly is fairly frequently. Yes, sir.
My question is about Iran and the U.S. approach to the nuclear program. I'm personally, as an Iranian American, very pessimistic about the approaches that are being carried out right now. For example, the economic sanctions would actually, if it was carried out, if it gets to that point, would actually hurt the Iranian population rather than the government. And second of all, if there is a last resort solution, such as a military attack on the sites, precisely, that might cause a reaction. So my question to you would be, what is your view, and do you think that those those scenarios would be effective to deal with this situation?
Well, as I said, the President's principal objective is to resolve this matter through peaceful and diplomatic means, but he has also said, and I think quite correctly, that it is unacceptable for Iran to have nuclear weapons. It is unacceptable to have a government such as Ahmadinejad's with the capability of destroying innocent civilian populations. It is unacceptable that that kind of regime could get those weapons and provoke imitators in other countries in the region and around the world that see that it's possible to defy the United States and other major powers, to flout their treaty obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and to acquire nuclear weapons capability. That's why the President says that he never takes any option off the table, but it is certainly not the preferred option. It's the last option. There's no doubt about it. The reason that we're looking at sanctions is obviously not to harm the people of Iran. We have no quarrel with them. Our quarrel is with the government that consistently and systematically over a 20-year period has been pursuing nuclear weapons. And many of our sanctions would be targeted against the regime, against their travel outside of Iran, against their bank deposits in various countries in Europe, against the commerce that helps keep the theocracy in power in Iran. And we have taken and proposed other steps as well. About 6 weeks ago, Secretary Rice proposed to increase funding of additional $75 million of funding for support for democratic elements inside and outside Iran. And I really think over time that is the ultimate solution to the Iranian the Iranian government's effort to acquire nuclear weapons, to have a truly democratic government elected in Iran that would be responsive to the people and that would not be so fascinated with this effort to get nuclear weapons. Yes, sir.
There was a report on the radio this morning that the United States government is changing its strategy with regard to negotiating with the North Koreans regarding their nuclear program, and that we're not going to ask for them to give up everything before we offer them some carrots. In other words, it would be a back and forth negotiation type of thing over a period of time. And I'm wondering whether you are familiar with that, just whether it's true
Nobody's
or not.
told me about that one. I must have missed the right radio program.
Well, okay, but I was wondering whether that had any application to the Iranian nuclear program, too. You referred to it as, in your comments, that in referring to the program, you said that if they were to give up everything, then we would do this. If they were to give up everything with regard to their program, then
Well,
we would do this.
which part of their support for terrorism would you permit them to keep?
I'm talking about the nuclear program.
Okay, I'm talking about both, because I think they go together. And I think that's important, as in the case of Libya, that it wasn't simply giving up the pursuit of nuclear weapons, although that was critical. It was also abandoning their support for international terrorism. And what we've said specifically in the case of Iran is that we want them to suspend uranium enrichment, which is the last critical step to get highly enriched uranium ultimately for fashioning into nuclear weapons. And they have, for 3 straight years, refused to do that. That's not just our demand. That's the same position as France, as Britain, as Germany, as Russia, and as China. So this is hardly a U.S. position taken in isolation. We have the support of all the other permanent members of the Security Council and Germany, and an overwhelming number of the members of the Board of Governors of the IAEA. That's what we're asking specifically, to allow the Europeans to begin to resume their negotiations. I don't think that's unreasonable.
The report was that by some diplomatic correspondent whose name I didn't get, came over the news this morning, that the State Department was changing its strategy and would not require them to give up everything before we started giving them certain benefits.
Well, you know, we tried that strategy in 1994 when we signed the agreed framework with North Korea, where they agreed to give up their plutonium reprocessing activities, plutonium being another route to nuclear weapons in addition to highly enriched uranium. And we said, Japan, South Korea said, if you give up that approach to nuclear weapons, we will supply you with 2 light water reactors and 500,000 tons of fuel oil a year to make up for the loss of electrical power supposedly generated by this particular reactor. The evidence is pretty clear that almost from the time the North Koreans signed the agreed framework, they began pursuing the enriched uranium route to nuclear power. And in fact, it was the uncovering of that as part of our uncovering of the whole AQ-CON network that led to the renunciation of the agreed framework, because the North Koreans had been violating it. You know, a lot of things are possible with both Iran and North Korea, but there's one common element that will run through both of them. We want full and effective verification. That's what the Libyans gave us. I mean, this is really remarkable. Before the public announcement of their decision to give up the pursuit of nuclear weapons, they allowed into their country CIA and SIS professionals. Now, when Iran and North Korea are serious about giving up the pursuit of nuclear weapons, we'll hear something similar from them. And to date, we have heard nothing in that regard.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
2 brief questions. The rationale for the lukewarm support we're receiving from Russia and China, one would assume, was due to their own economic self-interests. How can we create greater incentives for them to support our position? And it doesn't seem that the recent talk by our Vice President would seem to be provide some kind of incentive towards Russia to help us. The second brief question is this: what took us so long to address the situation in Darfur?
Well, on the first question, there's no mistaking the fact that Iran has very effectively used its oil and natural gas resources to try to acquire leverage over countries like China, India, Japan, countries with large and growing energy demands, to try to lock those countries into major capital investments in unexploited Iranian oil and gas fields, to use, for example, the fact that Japan currently purchases 15% of its petroleum needs from Iran, that Iran has tried to use those facts of energy policy to exert leverage over countries. And China, one of the 5 permanent members, I think is in a particularly vulnerable position for that kind of leverage to be exerted. Russia sees enormous potential market in Iran for the sale of nuclear power plants, the sale of fuel for the power plants, the sale of advanced, very sophisticated weapon systems, from anti-aircraft systems to jet fighters to a whole range of other things. And I think that this is a very critical factor in our effort to convince them to stick with us in applying pressure on Iran. France, Britain, other members of the European Union will suffer economic detriments themselves if additional sanctions are imposed on Iran. We face enormous economic consequences for the sanctions that we put on Iran because of their support for terrorism. But what we need to get from Russia and China is not to provide them with incentives, but to get them to internalize the same standards that we have, the same approach that we have, that our collective security is enhanced by denying countries like Iran or North Korea or others the possibility of acquiring weapons of mass destruction. We could sell and buy a lot to Iran, but what we want is safety globally against the threat of WMD proliferation. And we view that as a higher, more important goal than the economic goals. We have not yet succeeded in persuading Russia and China to internalize those, but that has to remain our objective over the long term, because the problem is not confined, although you read today about Iran and North Korea, the problem is not confined to those states. Others in their region and others around the world will draw the conclusion that if they can get away with it, it's worth it for them to try it as well. And that means you will have an increasing proliferation of states with nuclear or other WMD capabilities. Not that any of these states are any military consequence. There's no military threat to the United States. These are weapons of terror. These are weapons that regimes like Ahmadinejad or Kim Jong-il can use to hold hostage innocent civilian populations, either in the United States or our friends or allies. And it's not enough to say, well, ultimately, if they were foolish enough to use a nuclear weapon, they would face a devastating consequence. That logic, I don't think, logic that may make sense to all of us in this room, doesn't necessarily apply inside closed regimes like North Korea or Iran, which is why we put such a high priority on stopping these regimes from getting the weapons in the first place. Now, second, on Darfur, the principal responsibility for trying to negotiate a peaceful resolution of the genocide in Darfur, the conflict between the government of Khartoum and the Darfur rebels, has for some time been in the African Union. And the successful conclusion of the Abuja peace agreement a week and a half ago was the consequence of those efforts and the efforts of a lot of other governments, including our government. My colleague Bob Zellick, the Deputy Secretary of State, spent 5 sleepless days and nights in Abuja trying to get that agreement put in place. And now what we're trying to do is to get the government in Khartoum to open up to UN planners so that we can accomplish the most expeditious possible transition from the African Union force in Darfur to a UN peacekeeping force. And we were able earlier this week to get a significant resolution in the Security Council, adopted 15-0 with Russia and China on this occasion, to advance that process. But it's not through lack of trying on the part of the United States. It's through the existence of political conditions in Sudan and in Africa that have made it impossible to advance more expeditiously. But the objective, I think, is now solidified, and but the major problem remains whether the government in Khartoum and the rebel groups will adhere to the peace agreement that they just signed. Not all the rebel groups have signed the peace agreement. There are already indications of violations of the ceasefire that's been put in place. It's a very precarious situation. The inhabitants of the 3 Darfur provinces are themselves split among competing rebel factions. Darfur, while we're on the subject, is as large as France. This is not a small area that we're talking about. But I think the President, Secretary Rice have made this one of their highest priorities. Secretary Rice came to New York last week principally to address the Security Council on the subject of Darfur, and it's something that we work on every day in New York.
Mr. Ambassador, going back to Iraq and previous to your appointment, was it not a consideration of the administration equally of the possibility of Saddam or his 2 sons using non-nuclear conventional weapons as they did in the 1991 war on Israel, thus provoking a nuclear war in Israel?
You know, one of the reasons that we feared the capabilities of Saddam Hussein's regime in the area of weapons of mass destruction came not from intelligence that we relied on, but from the very declarations that Saddam Hussein made in 1991 and 1992 after the first Persian Gulf War. He was required by the terms of the Security Council ceasefire resolution to make a declaration of all of the assets he had in chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. And his own declaration contained extensive documentation about huge assets of chemical agent that could be used for chemical warfare purposes. And over the course of the 10 or 12 years after the ceasefire, the UN weapons inspectors made repeated efforts to find out where those chemical weapons were, whether they'd been destroyed, what documentation could be brought forward to show that the weapons had been destroyed. Now, these are weapons of incredible toxicity. It's not something you dump in the Tigris and Euphrates River or bury out in the sand somewhere. These have potentially lethal effects for many, many years, and even destroying them is a complex and hazardous operation. So when the UN weapons inspectors said to the Iraqis year after year after year, what did you do with those chemical weapons that you declared? The Iraqis simply said, oh, well, we destroyed them. So the UN weapons inspectors, trying to follow through on their obligations, said, well, then show us the records. Take us to the places where you destroyed these chemical weapons. Show us the furnaces in which you burned them. Show us how you destroyed them. Show us the records. And the Iraqis said, well, you know, we didn't keep any records. Didn't keep any records. Hans Blix, the last UN weapons inspector, who was very critical of the United States for its military action against Saddam, Hans Blix himself said to the Iraqis, confronted with this response, well, we didn't, you know, record keeping. We don't sort of do that in Iraq. Hans Blix said to them, and I quote, that stuff isn't marmalade. If you destroyed it, you have records of it. And they never submitted records. So prudent military planners assumed that if Saddam had declared it and couldn't prove it had been destroyed, it was a threat to our troops. And I think you're all familiar with the circumstances when military action began. Our troops and our allied troops went into Iraq with this cumbersome, heavy, awkward chemical weapons protective gear with them in the event that they faced an attack from chemical weapons to protect them against it. Now, no responsible American general would send troops into battle burdened with that kind of equipment unless they truly believed they faced a chemical weapons threat. So there were a lot of things that we now know were wrong in hindsight about Iraq's WMD capabilities. But it is simply not the case that we went in under false pretenses. It is not the case. We were straight with the American people, straight with the Congress, based on what we knew, and I believe to this day that the real threat posed at the time was not the state of Saddam's nuclear program or his chemical weapons program as it stood at the time of the initiation of military force. The real threat was Saddam Hussein, a man who had ordered the use of chemical weapons against his own Kurdish citizens, a man who had used chemical weapons against the Iranians in the Iran-Iraq War, a man who had invaded unprovoked the state of Kuwait. That is a threat to international peace and security. With or without weapons of mass destruction, I think the decision to use force was correct and necessary. And this will be the last question. Yes, ma'am.
Ambassador Bolton, thank you very much for fielding so many questions. I'm going to read mine so that I get it right. What steps might you be taking with the G77 countries to transcend the UN budget impasse so that the UN can continue after June 30th fully, not just down to 20%?
Right. Well, this is the G77, for those of you who don't know, is the Association of Developing Countries at the United Nations. There are actually 132 of them, but they still call themselves the Group of 77, just to keep you on your toes. They have a particular view of what kind of United Nations they want. They say they're in favor of reform, as we favor reform, but let me just tell you what they've done recently. Secretary General Kofi Annan, about 6 or 7 weeks ago, submitted a report to the General Assembly of the United Nations called Investing in the UN, and it was a program of reforms of the management structures of the UN, accounting systems, personnel systems, procurement systems, information technology, that sort of thing. Not the programs of the UN, not what the UN actually does with its $1.9 billion annual budget, but not the program side, but the management side. Now, in his report, Secretary General Annan said that what he believed the UN Secretariat needed, the bureaucracy that carries out all of these programs, Secretary General Annan himself said, and I quote, that he wanted a radical restructuring of the entire Secretariat, a radical restructuring of the entire Secretariat. We supported that position. We didn't support each and every specific reform that the Secretary General proposed, but we certainly supported the thrust of his recommendations, most of which we thought were really only first steps. We would go much further, but we thought these were legitimate first steps. The G77 opposed the Secretary General's report, and a couple of weeks ago forced a vote in the Budget Committee of the General Assembly that was then repeated in the full General Assembly, where they voted down the Secretary General's report. They voted it down. Not our recommendations, the Secretary General's recommendation. Voted down by a vote of 121 to 50. We were part of the 50. Now, let me just tell you one fact about those two votes. The 121 countries that voted to tank the Secretary General's report contribute about 12% of the total of the UN budget. The 50 countries that voted to support the report contribute 87% of the budget. Okay, that tells you a lot about what the central problem is at the UN, that there is a disjunction between voting power and contributions. Now, that's a big question. It's going to take a long time to resolve. We are currently working right now with some of our closest allies in a loose affiliation, a loose group of countries we call Juice Cans. Juice Cans, which is an acronym for Japan, the United States, Korea, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Juice Cans. Those 6 countries contribute 47% of the budget of the United Nations, and they are concerned, as we are, about reform. We will also work with the European Union, 25 member countries that contribute about 40% of the budget. We hope to hold together and expand not only the 50 votes we got, but to go into the G77 and talk to responsible, moderate members of the G77 to convince them of what we believe very profoundly, and that is that the reforms that we're seeking in the UN are not simply in the interest of the United States, they are in the interest of the entire organization. The organization runs better if it's more effective, if it's more transparent and more responsive, then we are more inclined to turn to it to solve international problems. I think America is a very practical country, and it makes decisions on a very straightforward cost-benefit basis. If this organization or that organization is available, can it solve this or that international problem? If it can't, if it's broken, can it be fixed? And if it can't be fixed, can we use something else? So our effort is to reform the UN to make it more attractive as a vehicle of international problem solving. And one of the ironies that we face in New York from some of the countries in the G77 that you've mentioned, some of the countries that are most critical of the United States for not using the UN more often are precisely the same countries that stand in the way of reform because they're satisfied with the system the way it is. You know, when Paul Volcker, who was the former chairman of our Federal Reserve System, looked into the oil for food scandal and produced several reports that are doorstop thick, very detailed examinations of mismanagement and corruption in the oil for food program, he came away with the conclusion, and really it was his central insight, that the problems of the oil for food program did not come out of thin air. The program was staffed with UN personnel, it used UN procedures, it carried with it the history of much activity in the UN. And what Volcker concluded was that the mismanagement and corruption that he found in the oil for food program were problems of the UN itself. Now, he was asked in a Senate hearing last year if he thought that there was a culture of corruption at the UN. And Volcker, who has devoted much of his career to public service and not a partisan man one way or the other, Volcker said, no, I don't think there's a culture of corruption at the UN, although there is corruption. I think there's a culture of inaction, a culture of inaction. Now, that's not the way the U.S. does business. I mean, we are action-oriented. We look at something and we say, how can we solve this problem? And that's why when Secretary Rice spoke to the General Assembly last September, she said that what the UN needed was a lasting revolution of reform. Now, it's not often that an American Secretary of State goes somewhere and calls for revolution, but that's how strongly we feel about it. So I think the question of the reform, the reform issue that you've raised is now a struggle between the revolution of reform that Secretary Rice wants and that culture of inaction that Chairman Volcker described. And we'll see if it's the irresistible force against the immovable object, and we'll just see who wins. Thank you very much.